In a single year, he lost the most watched role on American television, tens of millions of dollars of his own money, and an 18-year marriage. It wasn't the first time Kevin Costner lost everything at once. There's a certain kind of man Hollywood loves to build, and loves even more to tear down. A man who won 2 Oscars, shattered box office records around the world, and was called reckless for betting on stories no one else had the nerve to tell. A man the industry crowned, a publicly humiliated, quietly forgot, and then was forced to watch come back as the most watched actor on American television at 65 years old. But what the spotlight never showed was the real price of every single one of those bets. What it cost the family waiting at home while he built legends. The silence that piled up while the world stood and cheered. The second chance he destroyed the exact same way he destroyed the first one. How does a boy who never belonged anywhere become the defining symbol of American conviction? What really happened on the set of Waterworld? And why doesn't he regret a single day of it? What caused 2 marriages to collapse at the precise moment his career reached its highest point? And what drives a man to sink $38 million of his own money into a project the entire industry called madness? For the second time? To answer any of that, we have to go back to the beginning, to a kid who was always the new one in town, and learn to read every room before he ever walked into it. There is a particular kind of loneliness that belongs only to the child who is always the new kid. Kevin Michael Costner was born on January 18, 1955, in Linwood, California, the third son of Sharon Ray and William Costner. His father was a utility worker for Southern California Edison, a practical man who believed in discipline, routine, and the quiet dignity of honest labor. His mother was warm but stretched thin, raising 3 boys across a life defined not by roots, but by movement. The family moved constantly. Compton, Delano, Visalia, Villa Park. Every few years, a new town, a new school, a new set of strangers to navigate. Kevin later recalled with a kind of aching honesty that he never truly felt he belonged anywhere growing up. He was always arriving somewhere that already had its friendships formed, its social hierarchies set, its invisible walls already built. "I was always the new kid," he admitted years later. And when you're always the new kid, so you learn to observe, you learn to read a room before you walk into it. That habit of observation, of watching before acting, of studying people before trusting them, would become the invisible foundation of everything he built as an actor. But as a boy, it was simply loneliness dressed in adaptability. What saved him in those years of endless transition was water and words. Kevin fell in love with swimming early, of competing with enough dedication that it briefly seemed like a possible future. But it was stories that held him deepest. He devoured books, lost himself in films, and began writing poetry as a teenager. Private verses that no one else read, confessions he could not yet speak aloud. In church, he sang in the choir, developing without realizing it the instinct for performance, for inhabiting a feeling and projecting it outward to strangers. His parents were church-going Baptists, and faith shaped the household's rhythm. But what shaped Kevin more than doctrine was his father's relentless insistence on work. William Costner was not a man who tolerated passivity. If you were not building something, you were wasting time. That lesson embedded itself so deeply in Kevin that decades later, when Hollywood laughed at his ambitions, he would respond not with arguments, but with action, by building anyway. At California State University, Fullerton. See, Kevin studied business administration, a practical concession to practicality. He was not yet ready to say aloud the thing he most wanted. Acting felt too exposed, too vulnerable, too far from the measured world his father inhabited. So he studied business. He wore the responsible mask. But the dream would not stay quiet. In those college years, he began taking acting classes on the side, slipping into workshops and small theater productions as though testing whether the feeling was real or just fantasy. It was real. It burned with a consistency that nothing else in his life matched. By the time he graduated in 1978, he had made a decision that terrified him. He was going to pursue acting, not as a hobby, not as a backup plan, as everything. His parents were not cruel about it, but they were honest. His father, in particular, I saw the odds with the clear eyes of a man who had spent his life in practical labor. The conversation was not a fight. It was simply the quiet weight of someone who loved him, asking him to be realistic. Kevin heard the concern. He did not change his direction. He married Cindy Silva in 1978, his college sweetheart, a woman who would stand beside him through the years of absolute obscurity that followed. Those early years of marriage were defined not by glamour, but by survival. St. Kevin worked as a stagehand, drove a truck, labored in a fish hatchery. He took whatever came. He showed up to every audition he could find. He collected rejections the way other people collect regrets. Hollywood, in those years, did not see Kevin Costner. Not really. He landed small parts, blink-and-miss-them appearances in films that went nowhere. He was the kind of actor that casting directors filed away under fine, but not memorable. The machinery of the industry ground forward without him, and he pushed against it daily with the stubbornness of a man who had been the new kid in too many towns to believe that belonging was something you waited for. Then came the moment that nearly ended it before it began. In 1983, Kevin was cast in a small but meaningful role in Lawrence Kasdan's The Big Chill, a film about a group of college friends reuniting after the death of a mutual friend. Kevin played the dead friend. His scenes were shot as flashbacks. He prepared meticulously. He gave everything he had to those brief, quiet moments on set. Then the editor cut him entirely. Not trimmed. Gone. His only scene in the final film was a glimpse of his legs being dressed for burial. He had worked for years for this moment, and the moment had been erased. Most people would have heard that as a verdict. Kevin Costner heard it as a warning he refused to accept. Lawrence Kasdan, unaware of what had happened, felt the guilt of it and reached out. He would give Kevin another chance, a real one. That chance would come in 1985 with Silverado, a sweeping western that finally gave Kevin Costner a stage worthy of what he had been carrying in silence for years. The new kid had finally found a place to belong, and he would never let go of it. Silverado did not make Kevin Costner a star overnight, but it did something more important. It made Hollywood look at him differently. In a film crowded with established names, Danny Glover, Scott Glenn, Jeff Goldblum, Kevin Kline. Kevin Costner held his own with an effortless, almost dangerous charisma. He was loose where others were stiff, magnetic where others were merely competent. Audiences noticed. Directors noticed. And slowly, the machinery that had ignored him for years began to turn in his direction. What followed was not a gradual climb. It was a detonation. In 1987, the Untouchables placed Kevin Costner opposite Sean Connery and Robert De Niro, two of the most commanding presences in cinema history. He did not shrink. He anchored. As Eliot Ness, he carried the moral weight of the film on his shoulders with quiet conviction. And the performance confirmed what Silverado had only suggested, that this was not a man who needed the camera to find him. He already knew exactly where to stand. Then came Bull Durham in 1988, and something shifted permanently. The film was smaller, warmer, funnier. A love story wrapped around minor league baseball, a world of dust and dreams and men who are almost good enough, but never quite. Kevin Costner did not play a hero in Bull Durham. He played a man, a flawed, self-aware, yet deeply romantic man who delivered lines about life and belief with a naturalness that felt less like acting and more like breathing. The film was a phenomenon, and Kevin Costner became, overnight, the most desired leading man in Hollywood. The industry that had once filed him under fine but not memorable was now filing scripts at his door. Field of Dreams arrived in 1989, and it crystallized something essential about what Kevin Costner represented on screen. And he was not the explosive action hero of the era. Not Schwarzenegger, not Stallone. He was something rarer and, for many audiences, more resonant. He was the ordinary man who believed in extraordinary things. The man who built a baseball diamond in a cornfield because a voice told him to. The man who stood at the edge of the impossible and chose faith over reason. Audiences wept, not because the film manipulated them, but because Kevin Costner made them believe that the man on screen genuinely felt every word he spoke. If you build it, he will come. A line so simple it should not work. In his hands, it became unforgettable. But the moment that truly crowned him came in 1990, when Kevin Costner did something that Hollywood had quietly advised him against. He directed himself in an epic western about a Union soldier who finds his humanity living among the Lakota Sioux. The film was nearly 3 hours long. It was set in a period that studios considered box office poison. It had long stretches of dialogue delivered entirely in the Lakota language, unsubtitled and unhurried. Every studio calculation said it would fail. Dances with Wolves won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Director. Kevin Costner stood at the podium at the 63rd Academy Awards, not as the industry's reluctant gamble, but as its undisputed champion. He had not simply made a successful film, he had made a statement. That audiences were hungrier for depth, for beauty, for moral complexity than the industry had bothered to believe. And he had staked his own money, his own credibility, his own name on that belief. He was 35 years old. He was the most powerful actor-director in the world. And the boy who had never belonged anywhere now had his name on everything. What the applause could not reveal was the cost already accumulating in the shadows. The same obsessive conviction that had carried him to the podium was reshaping his private life in ways that Cindy, his wife of 12 years, was beginning to feel in ways no Oscar could compensate for. Kevin's commitment to his work was not simply professional dedication. It was total absorption. On the set of Dances with Wolves, he had spent months in remote South Dakota, directing, acting, problem-solving, and present to the film in a way he was increasingly unable to be present to his family. Cindy had stood beside him through every year of obscurity, every rejection, every truck-driving job and fish hatchery shift. She had believed in him when the industry did not. She had built a home and raised their children, Annie, Lily, and Joe, while he built his legend. And now that the legend had arrived, she found herself standing at the edge of it, looking in. Kevin later admitted, with the particular pain of a man who understands exactly what he lost. I wasn't as present as I should have been. I was always somewhere else in my head. But in 1990, none of that darkness had yet broken through the surface. In 1992, The Bodyguard shattered box office records and paired him with Whitney Houston in one of the most iconic screen romances of the decade. The soundtrack became one of the best-selling albums in history. Kevin Costner was no longer just a critical darling. He was a global phenomenon. The kind of star whose name alone could greenlight any project, fill any arena, silence any room. He had built it. They had come. All of them. And standing at the absolute summit of American cinema, with Oscars on his shelf, hundreds of millions in his wake, and the world's attention locked on his every move, Kevin Costner made the decision that would define the next chapter of his life. And he decided to build something even bigger. And in doing so, he lit the fuse on the most spectacular explosion in Hollywood history. There is a particular kind of courage that the world only recognizes in hindsight. In the moment, it looks exactly like madness. By 1993, Kevin Costner had earned the rarest currency Hollywood offers: unconditional trust. Studios would greenlight his projects on his name alone. Producers returned his calls before the first ring finished. The man who had once driven trucks and cleaned fish for a living now commanded fees of $15 million per film. And every major director in the industry considered him their first call. He could have coasted. He could have chosen safe, profitable films that demanded nothing from him but his face and his name. Many men in his position did exactly that, and lived comfortably inside the warm, unchallenging glow of maintained stardom. Kevin Costner chose a flooded apocalypse instead. The project was called Waterworld, a science fiction epic set in a future where the polar ice caps had melted entirely, and drowning every continent beneath an endless, merciless ocean. The last survivors of humanity drifted on floating atolls, fighting over scraps of dirt and the fading memory of dry land. Kevin would star as the Mariner, a solitary, gill-bearing mutant navigating this drowned world with cold ferocity and buried humanity. It was, by any conventional measure, an insane gamble. The original budget was set at approximately $100 million, already the most expensive film ever proposed at that point in cinema history. Kevin not only committed to star in it, he stepped in as a producer, injecting his own money, staking his own credibility, and attaching his name to every decision made on that production. What followed was not simply a difficult shoot. It was a prolonged, public, increasingly humiliating catastrophe. Filming took place almost entirely on open ocean near Hawaii, on a massive artificial atoll constructed at staggering cost. The structure was repeatedly damaged by storms. Equipment sank. Schedules collapsed. The Hawaiian waters, beautiful from the shore, were brutal and unpredictable in practice. Salt water corroding machinery, currents disrupting carefully planned shots, the relentless Pacific refusing to cooperate with any human timetable. The budget swelled. First to $130 million, then $150, and then $175 million, a number so obscene for 1995 that the press could not stop repeating it. Kevin Costner, once the golden boy of American cinema, was now the punchline of every industry conversation. Kevin's gills, fish tar. A cruel reference to the legendary flop Ishtar, designed to signal that history was about to repeat itself at catastrophic scale. Late-night hosts sharpened their jokes. To trade publications ran daily updates on the spiraling budget as though reporting on a slow-motion train derailment. And Kevin was at the center of it, every day, on the water, in the heat, soaked and sunburned and refusing to stop. The reports from set were not kind. Stories circulated of creative tensions with director Kevin Reynolds, of disagreements about the film's tone and direction, of an atmosphere thick with pressure and frustration. Reynolds eventually departed before post-production was complete, leaving Kevin to shepherd the film through its final stages largely alone. When Waterworld was finally released in July 1995, the reviews were not the massacre the press had promised. They were worse. They were indifferent. Critics acknowledged ambition and scale while dismissing execution. The film was not a disaster in the way its detractors had gleefully predicted. It performed respectably at the global box office, eventually turning a profit when international sales and home video were factored in. But profit was never the point anymore. The story had already been written. Waterworld had become a symbol of excess, of ego, of a star who had flown too close to the sun and paid the price in public humiliation. Every article, every late-night monologue, every industry whisper repeated the same verdict. Kevin Costner had overreached. The king had stumbled. And Hollywood, which had celebrated him with unconditional adoration only 5 years earlier, now watched his difficulties with barely concealed satisfaction. The cruelty of it was precise. The same industry that had ignored him for a decade, then worshipped him for half a decade, now turned its back with the casual efficiency of people who had never truly believed in him at all. Kevin later admitted, with the measured calm of a man who had processed a very old wound. "So I knew the film wasn't what we hoped it would be, but I also knew we gave everything we had. I don't regret trying. I regret that we didn't get to finish it the way we intended." But the empire did not stop burning with Waterworld. In 1997, still carrying the weight of that public humiliation, Kevin returned with The Postman, another sweeping, ambitious epic set in a post-apocalyptic America. A film about hope and community and the stubborn human need for connection even in the ruins of civilization. He directed it himself. He poured his conviction into it with the same total commitment he had brought to Dances with Wolves 7 years earlier. The difference was that this time the world had already made up its mind about him. The Postman was savaged. Critics who might have engaged with its themes under different circumstances arrived sharpened by the narrative of Costner's decline and found in the film's earnestness only evidence of delusion. The film lost tens of millions of dollars. The Razzie Awards nominated it in nearly every category. Golden Globe nominations for Worst Picture, Worst Director, Worst Actor. His name attached to each one like a public flogging. And the man who had stood at the Academy Awards podium 7 years earlier accepting Best Director was now being handed mock trophies for the worst work in Hollywood. He did not disappear. He did not publicly collapse. He showed up to interviews, answered questions with the quiet, measured dignity of someone who had decided that falling apart was not an option he was willing to exercise. But the cost of that composure was invisible to everyone watching. Behind the controlled exterior, the empire was not just burning professionally. It was burning personally. And the fire that would cause the deepest damage was not lit on any film set or any ocean surface. It was burning at home. And it had been burning for years. There are men who lose everything in a single, visible moment. And there are men who lose everything slowly, quietly, in the spaces between success. In the silences that accumulate when ambition fills every room and leaves no space for the people who were there before the applause began. Kevin Costner was the second kind of man. His marriage to Cindy Silva had begun in the most ordinary and human of circumstances. They were college sweethearts at Cal State Fullerton, two young people who had chosen each other before either of them had anything to offer beyond sincerity and the uncertain promise of a shared future. Cindy had not married a movie star. She had married a man who drove trucks and dreamed of acting, who carried rejection home every evening and got up the next morning to collect more. She had chosen him in his invisibility, and that choice had meant everything. Through the lean years of the early 1980s, or through the small parts and the near misses and the humiliation of being cut entirely from the big chill, Cindy had been the constant. The steady, grounding presence that made the instability survivable. They built a family together. Annie, Lily, Joe. 3 children raised in the long shadow of a dream that was always almost arriving. And then it arrived. Completely. Overwhelmingly. The same year that Dances with Wolves swept the Academy Awards and placed Kevin Costner at the absolute summit of global cinema, the fractures in his marriage that had been forming quietly for years became impossible to ignore. The very qualities that had made him extraordinary on screen. His obsessive commitment, his total absorption in whatever world he was building, his inability to be present to anything he was not actively creating, had been slowly and methodically eroding the life he and Cindy had constructed together. Fame, when it arrives at that scale, does not simply change the person who receives it. It changes the architecture of every relationship surrounding that person. Suddenly, there are assistants and publicists and lawyers and producers filling every hour. Suddenly, the family home, once the refuge from the world, becomes a satellite orbiting a career that never stops moving. See, suddenly, the woman who stood beside you in obscurity finds herself standing beside a version of you that the world has claimed. Cindy filed for divorce in 1994. 16 years of marriage, 3 children, and a settlement that, by the standards of celebrity divorces, was staggering. Reportedly close to $80 million, one of the largest divorce settlements in Hollywood history at that time. The financial blow was significant. But Kevin later indicated, carefully and without self-pity, that the financial cost was the least of what the divorce cost him. What it cost him could not be calculated in dollars. It was the private acknowledgement of a man who had chased something magnificent and left something irreplaceable behind in the process. "I was not the husband I should have been," he admitted years later. "I was not as present as she deserved. That's the truth of it." No blame deflected, no excuses constructed. Just the plain, a heavy weight of a man accounting for himself honestly. What made the timing particularly brutal was its precision. The divorce arrived simultaneously with the public humiliation of Waterworld, meaning that in the mid-1990s, Kevin Costner was losing his marriage and his professional standing at exactly the same moment. The press, predictably, treated both as entertainment. Tabloids dissected the settlement. Trade publications dissected the box office. Sir and Kevin navigated both collapses in full public view, with a composure that many mistook for coldness, and which was, in reality, something closer to controlled grief. He did not stop working. He never stopped working. But those who were close to him in those years described a man who had grown quieter. Not broken, but altered. The easy confidence of the early 1990s had been replaced by something more considered, more watchful, and more aware of the fragility beneath every apparent certainty. In the years following the divorce, Kevin entered a period of rebuilding that was neither linear nor clean. He dated publicly, his relationships documented with the invasive thoroughness that celebrity culture demands. He remained deeply involved as a father, a commitment that those around him described as genuine and unwavering, a man who showed up for his children with the consistency he had struggled to maintain in his marriage. In 2004, he married Christine Baumgartner, a handbag designer he had known for several years. Christine was quieter than the Hollywood world that surrounded Kevin. Composed, private, and seemingly content to stand beside rather than in front of his career. For 18 years, the marriage appeared to be the redemption story. The second chapter, written with the wisdom of the first chapter's failures. Kevin spoke about her with the warmth of a man who believed he had finally learned something essential about himself. They had 3 children together, Caden, Hayes, and Grace. And Kevin built around them a life that seemed, from the outside, to have found its balance at last. The ranch in Aspen, the house in Santa Barbara, the slower pace of a man who had survived his own excesses and chosen presence over empire. But beneath that domestic peace, a tension was quietly gathering. Kevin's relationship with his work had never truly changed. The obsessive commitment, the total absorption, the inability to release a vision once it had taken hold of him. These were not habits he had outgrown. They were the architecture of who he was. And in the late 2010s, that architecture found a new object of total devotion. A television show set on the open ranch lands of Montana. A project so consuming, so demanding, so completely Kevin Costner in its ambition and its scale that it would eventually cost him more than Waterworld and the divorce from Cindy Silva combined. Not in money, in everything else. But before that final storm arrived, there was a resurrection. A return so unexpected and so complete that Hollywood, the same industry that had spent a decade burying him, had no choice but to watch in stunned silence as the man they had dismissed rebuilt himself from the ground up. And he did it not in a boardroom or a studio or a negotiating table. He did it on horseback, in the Montana dust, in front of more viewers than any of his accusers had ever commanded. Hollywood has a particular way of forgetting people. It is not dramatic. There is no announcement, no formal exile, no single door slammed shut. It is simply a gradual cooling. Calls returned a little more slowly, projects attached to younger names, the quiet institutional consensus that a certain chapter has closed and a new one has begun without you. By the mid-2000s, Kevin Costner had experienced that cooling firsthand. The films kept coming. Open Range in 2003, In The Upside of Anger in 2005, Mr. Brooks in 2007, and each one demonstrated that his craft had not diminished. If anything, the humiliations of the 1990s had deepened him as a performer, stripped away the invincibility, and replaced it with something more textured, more human, more honest. Critics who engaged with his work during this period noted a new quality in his performances. See, a lived-in gravity that could only come from a man who had genuinely lost things he valued. But the audience numbers were smaller. The cultural conversation had moved on. Kevin Costner, to the broader public, had become a figure of nostalgia rather than urgency. A name associated with a particular golden era that felt increasingly distant. He did not rage against that diminishment. He worked around it. He invested in music, touring with his band Kevin Costner and Modern West, playing smaller venues with the unpretentious enthusiasm of a man who simply loved the act of performance, regardless of the scale. He focused on his children, on his ranch, on the slower rhythms of a life built around presence rather than dominance. And then, in 2018, Taylor Sheridan called. Sheridan was a writer and director whose work, Sicario, Hell or High Water, Wind River, had established him as one of the most compelling voices in contemporary American storytelling. His scripts carried the weight of landscape and the moral complexity of men caught between competing loyalties, between law and survival, between love and ambition. He was building a television series about a powerful Montana ranching dynasty, a family clinging to their land against the encroachment of developers, politicians, and the relentless machinery of modern America. He wanted Kevin Costner to be John Dutton. The role was not a concession to nostalgia. It was not a gentle reminder of past glories wrapped in comfortable familiarity. John Dutton was a man of genuine contradictions, ruthless in his protection of what he loved, tender in the private moments the world never saw, carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who had fought the same war for so long that victory and survival had become indistinguishable. Kevin Costner read the script and recognized something in those pages that went beyond acting opportunity. He recognized himself. Yellowstone premiered on the Paramount Network in June 2018, and the response was not immediate thunder. It built, slowly, organically, through word of mouth and the particular loyalty of an audience that felt, perhaps for the first time in years, that a major television production was speaking directly to them rather than past them. Viewers in rural America, in ranching communities, in the vast middle of the country that Hollywood so often overlooked, found in Yellowstone a world that reflected their own. Its landscapes, its values, its unresolved tensions between tradition and transformation. By its third and fourth seasons, Yellowstone had become the most watched show on American cable television. Not in its demographic, not in its time slot, in all of cable television. More than 10 million viewers per episode, a cultural phenomenon that no algorithm had predicted and no studio executive had greenlit with confidence. Kevin Costner, at 65 years old, was the biggest star on American television. The industry that had cooled toward him watched in genuine astonishment. The man they had filed under nostalgia was commanding audiences that the prestige streaming platforms spent billions attempting to attract. He had not chased the resurrection. He had simply told the truth on screen with the same total commitment he had always brought to every role, and the audience had found him. But the triumph arrived wrapped in a tension that the public would not fully understand until it broke open in the most public and painful way possible. Behind the scenes of Yellowstone, a conflict had been building between Kevin Costner and the show's production over his availability for filming. Kevin had, in parallel with Yellowstone's success, committed himself to the most ambitious project of his later career. Horizon, an American saga. A four-part epic western he had been developing for decades. A sweeping examination of westward expansion in post-Civil War America that he would direct, produce, and star in simultaneously. The project consumed him completely. Financing it required him to invest tens of millions of his own money. Reports estimated his personal contribution at $38 million. Scheduling it around Yellowstone's production demands became increasingly untenable. And the negotiations that followed were, by multiple accounts, bruising and irreconcilable. In May 2023, it was announced that Kevin Costner would not return for the second half of Yellowstone's fifth season. The press framed it as a departure. Those closer to the situation described it as something more painful. A collision between two total commitments, neither of which Kevin was willing to surrender, resulting in the loss of one by default. And the timing was devastating in its precision. Just 1 month later, in June 2023, Christine Baumgartner filed for divorce. 18 years of marriage, 3 children. The relationship Kevin had built as the corrected version of himself. The wiser, more present, more deliberate man who had learned from the failures of his first marriage was ending. The reasons were private, as both parties maintained with consistent dignity throughout the proceedings. But the timing was merciless. Kevin was simultaneously losing the television show that had rebuilt his cultural relevance, absorbing the financial pressure of a massively expensive independent film and navigating the collapse of his second marriage. The tabloids ran the divorce and the Yellowstone departure as parallel storylines, treating both as evidence of a man in free fall. The settlement negotiations were contentious and public. I reported in detail that neither Kevin nor Christine had invited. The proceedings stretched across months, conducted in the glare of a press that had never lost its appetite for his difficulties. When the divorce was finalized in late 2023, Kevin Costner had lost, within the space of a single year, his marriage, his most commercially successful role, and tens of millions of dollars invested in a film that the industry was already watching with skeptical eyes. On Horizon, An American Saga, Chapter 1, was released in June 2024. It was, by any honest assessment, exactly what Kevin Costner had always been: ambitious, earnest, deeply committed, and operating at a scale that defied easy commercial calculation. Critics acknowledged its scope and sincerity. Audiences, shaped by decades of faster-paced storytelling, struggled to meet it on its own unhurried terms. The box office was disappointing. Chapter 2, originally scheduled for a theatrical release that same summer, was pulled from the calendar. The man who had once been told Dances with Wolves was too long, too quiet, too earnest to succeed, and had proved them wrong with 7 Oscars, now found himself in the exhausting position of defending a vision the world was not yet ready to receive. He stood in front of cameras at Cannes, composed and unbroken, and said the words that had defined his entire life. "I believe in this story. I will finish it." It was not defiance for its own sake. It was not ego refusing to acknowledge reality. It was simply Kevin Costner being exactly who he had always been. The boy who was always the new kid. The man who drove trucks and dreamed of something larger. The director who built a baseball diamond in a cornfield because a voice told him to. The actor who bet everything on a flooded apocalypse and a Montana ranch and a 4-part Western epic that the industry called madness. He had always been willing to stand alone in the field and believe that if he built it, they would come. That faith had broken him more than once. It had also given him everything he ever loved. In the autumn of 2024, Kevin Costner turned 69 years old. He did not mark the occasion with a press release or a carefully orchestrated public appearance. He spent it, by all accounts, the way he had learned to spend the things that mattered most. Quietly, privately, with his children nearby, and the wide, unhurried landscape of the American West somewhere in his line of sight. The man who had once commanded $15 million per film, who had swept the Academy Awards and broken box office records and been simultaneously crowned and crucified by the most powerful entertainment industry in the world, had arrived at a place that no amount of money or fame had been able to manufacture for him during the years when he had everything. Peace. Not the peace of a man who had stopped caring, not the resignation of someone who had made his calculations and accepted the remainder, but the particular peace of a man who has been tested at every level. Financially, physically, personally, professionally, and has discovered, through the accumulated weight of genuine loss, what actually holds. His children hold. All 6 of them. Annie, Lily, and Joe, from his marriage to Cindy. Liam, his son with Bridget Rooney, and Caden, Hayes, and Grace from his years with Christine, are the architecture of a life built not in studios or boardrooms, but in the ordinary, irreplaceable accumulation of presence. Kevin has spoken about fatherhood with a tenderness that his earlier, more armored self would barely have recognized. A man who understands now, with the clarity that only real loss can provide, that the most important performances of his life have never been captured on film. His craft holds. He is still writing, is still developing Horizon's remaining chapters with the patient conviction of a man who has learned that some stories simply require more time than the world is initially willing to give them. He has been here before. He built a baseball diamond in a cornfield. He danced with wolves on the South Dakota plains. He knows what it means to believe in something before anyone else is ready to believe in it with you. His identity holds. Not the identity constructed by tabloids and trade publications and the industry's endlessly recycled narratives of rise and fall and rise again. The identity that was always there beneath all of it. The restless boy from Linwood who observed before he acted, who wrote private poetry that no one else read, who chose the exposed and vulnerable path of storytelling over the safe and sensible path of business administration. And never once, in 40 years of public life, I pretended to be anything other than exactly who he was. That refusal to pretend has cost him enormously. It has also been the only thing about him that was never for sale. The greatest stars of any era are not defined by their peaks. They are defined by what they choose to protect when everything around them is collapsing. What they refuse to surrender, even when surrender would be easier, cleaner, less painful. Kevin Costner chose his stories. He chose his children. He chose the belief that if you build something with genuine conviction and total commitment, the right audience will eventually find their way to it. He has been wrong about the timing more than once. He has never been wrong about the building. And perhaps that is the truest measure of a life lived on one's own terms. Not that every gamble paid off, not that every relationship endured, not that every vision was received the way it deserved, but that, when the noise finally quieted and the applause finally faded and the industry moved on to its next obsession, the man left standing in the field was still himself. Completely, unapologetically, irreducibly himself. If his journey moved you, if you have ever bet on something you believed in despite the odds, or lost something that mattered more than you knew how to say, or simply refused to stop building when the world told you to stop, I leave a like as a testament to a man who never once pretended that the field was anything other than exactly what it was. Subscribe for more untold stories of the lives behind the legends. Because the most powerful thing about Kevin Costner's story is not the Oscars or the billions or the global fame. It is the simplest and most human thing of all. He kept going. Even when it cost him everything, he kept going.